Good morning, everyone. Today we will be tackling one of the most controversial and delicate issues of our age, terrorism and terrorists. In the next lesson, we will look at two examples of terrorist activities, the Irish Troubles and the 9/11 attacks on the Twin Towers, their causes and their consequences. Today, however, we will look at the general idea of terrorism. In particular, we will ask ourselves the following questions. What is terrorism? Why do people become terrorists? Are all acts of political violence terrorism? And then I will give you a model answer, which you can use to answer the exercise, the question in the Google form. So, what is terrorism? Before we proceed, we need to clarify a few misconceptions. Are all terrorists Muslim? Absolutely not. This is an idea we have, but it's very new, okay? This idea is in our mind mostly since 9/11 2001. Before 2001, most terrorists were either fanatic communists or fanatic fascists or anything in between, or had different motives. The idea that Muslims are terrorists starts with the 9/11 attacks. Furthermore, in the past few years, Europe and America saw a massive increase in the acts of terrorism performed by white supremacist and racist individuals, which killed dozens of people in the past years, and unfortunately will probably continue. So some Muslims are terrorists, but not all terrorists are Muslim. Second point, are all Muslims terrorists? Again, absolutely not. Despite recent propaganda, despite recent ideas and recent events, we should never think that Muslim equals terrorist. Most Muslims are normal people. They can be smart, they can be stupid, they can be nice, or they can be unpleasant, like everyone else. Some do actually turn into terrorists, but religion often has little to do with it, and there are more complicated causes, okay? Religion by itself is almost never a sufficient cause to turn a normal, law-abiding person into a terrorist. There are other reasons, which in a way we will go into more detail. Moving on. The simple definition of terrorism is acts of violence committed in order to make a political point. This is, of course, a very loose definition, but we can identify a few common elements of most terrorist actions. First, they are illegal. Even in war, as strange as it may sound, wars have rules. Rules about who you can or you cannot attack. You cannot attack civilians. You cannot attack people who do not have a uniform or a sign that denotes which faction they are. There are rules determining which weapons you can or cannot use, which buildings you can or cannot destroy, okay? Terrorist attacks generally make use of illegal weapons or commit illegal actions, okay? Both in peace and in war. Of course, during peace, it's illegal to commit any form of violent, aggressive action. But there are also rules in war, so there can be acts of terrorism in war as well. Second point, undefended targets. Most attacks are against targets that are not defended, that are innocuous, okay, like train stations, stadiums, or other civilian buildings. Terrorists want to make a point, and in order to do so, they generally want to make as many victims as possible. It depends, or at least as big a damage as possible. In the last lesson, we looked at Nelson Mandela, and we said that, yes, he did some terrorist attacks. However, his terrorist attacks were planned not to kill anyone. However, they did target civilian infrastructures like roads, like power station, and so on. Political reasons. Now, this is the third characteristic of a terrorist attack. We said that the first is that they are illegal, the second is that they are against undefended targets, and now we're going to see the political reasons. Terrorist attacks are not blind fits of violence. It's just not punching someone in the face because you're very angry. You need to have a political reason, and you need to have to make a point. You want to punch someone in the face because you don't agree about their stance on workers' rights. That can be considered a terrorist attack. in a way. Terrorists generally want to show a government what would happen if they do not listen to the terrorist demand. Or maybe they want to scare the population so that they stop supporting the government. Whatever the motives, whatever the reasons, the ultimate goal is always a political change of some sort. Fourth characteristics of terrorist attacks. Fear. Now, the word terrorism, as you can imagine, comes from the word terror. Most terrorist attacks do not expect things to change immediately, but want to make people react out of fear, out of the terror of what could happen next if they do not comply with what the terrorists want. So, I hope this sort of definition was clear. Acts of political violence with these four characteristics. They are illegal and unlawful. They are against undefended targets. They are done for political reasons, and their main aim is to spread fear. So why do people become terrorists? This is the billion-dollar question. Why do people commit actions of unspeakable evil in order to achieve a political goal? There are two main reasons: ideology and the relative lack of military power. Let's look at them one by one with a few examples. First, ideology. People can commit unspeakable evils and even kill innocent people if they believe that they are right. Today, the internet has made it, unfortunately, much easier to enter into contact with ideas that look good, but that push people over the edge and turn them into terrorists. But this has sort of always been a problem, at least in the 20th century, even before then, of course. Here are a few examples of ideological terrorism, of people that turned into terrorists for ideological reasons. First, in June 1914, you might have heard this one, a Serbian terrorist named Gavrilo Princip shot the Archduke of Austria, Franz Ferdinand. He wanted to convince the government, out of fear of the government of the Austrian Empire, to give freedom to the Serbian provinces under the Austrian Empire. His action, however, as you know already, started a chain reaction that led to the First World War and to the death of millions of people. Second example. In the 1970s, many Italian communists wanted to convince the workers, the factory workers, to rise against the capitalist system, which they saw as unjust and oppressive. And there was also the fact that it was during the Cold War, so they were supported by the Soviet Union. It gets very complicated very easily. Let's keep it simple. In order to convince the population to rise up, they bombed factories. More importantly, they kidnapped or killed important politicians. One example here is the kidnapping of Italian Prime Minister Aldo Moro in 1978 by a communist terrorist group. Much more recently, unfortunately, in July 2011, a Norwegian racist named Anders Breivik bought a gun and started shooting innocent children at a summer camp. He also had planted a bomb in a Norwegian government building that exploded at the same time. Many of those children were immigrants and were, we can say, leftist, of a political ideology that was the opposite of Breivik's. But in his madness, despite these people being innocent children, effectively, in his madness, Breivik believed that he was defending his country and his race against an invasion. Again, we see ideology pushing people over the limit. Second reason why people become terrorists, essentially because they have no alternative, because they lack military power, the military power required to take different actions. In many poor countries that are fighting a war or are living under foreign military occupation, the local population generally does want to kick out the invaders, but they do not have the means to do that. Maybe they do not have an army, maybe they are poor, maybe they do not have access to weapons or whatever. Therefore, they resort to terrorist tactics such as bombing crowded places, suicide bombings, and so on. As noble in air quotes as their ideals of freedom might sound, and again in 1,000 air quotes, they invariably involved the death of innocent civilians who had nothing to do with the war and did not want to, of course, die because of this sort of political squabbles. A few examples. This is a bit controversial, but I think that it shows us the nature of terrorism in a way. During the Second World War, resistant fighters were called terrorists by the Nazis and fascist enemies. Now we know that they were on the right side. They were on the correct side of history. However, they were called terrorists by the Nazis and the fascists. Those fighters did not have the power to openly challenge the Nazi and fascist armies. So they made small hit-and-run attacks. They bombed barracks, they intercepted small groups of soldiers and surprised them by showering them with bombs and bullets, this sort of things. Often, the Nazis retaliated by killing innocent people, innocent civilians, to punish the resistant fighters. There was this famous episode in Rome, I think it was in 1944, I might be wrong, in which after an attack of the resistance against a group of Nazi soldiers, the Nazi commander said, well, we will start punishing, we'll start killing 10 Italians for every dead German. And they did, and it was a massacre, and it was terrible. Second example, after the NATO invasion of Afghanistan in 2001, many groups, like the Taliban, began using suicide bombers against the American, British, and other NATO soldiers in the area. Very often, these attacks would be suicidal, and they would kill large numbers of Afghans and other civilians, other unarmed civilians, but no enemy soldiers. Third example, this is a personal story. In 2011, I was living in Turkey, and well, there was a group fighting for the independence of the Kurdish people from the country, from the Republic of Turkey, which made a bus explode in the Turkish capital of Ankara, killing 13 people. I was supposed to be on that very same bus on that very same morning, but luckily I decided to remain home and sleep a couple of hours more, because I did not feel like going out that morning, and therefore I avoided the attack. Now, that was lucky. The Kurds are a people that has been fighting a war with the Turkish army for the past 40 years. They do not have a proper army themselves. Again, the situation is a bit more complicated. I'm simplifying it a lot. So they feel like they must make this sort of attacks in order to compensate the lack of military power. Now, let's ask ourselves another difficult and important question. Are all acts of violence, of political violence, terrorism? I will now present to you the, again, very much simplified details of an act of political violence. Based on the content of this lesson, I would then like you to decide whether it was terrorism or not, if you decide to go for the gold in the final answer. Remember to use example from this story or from other examples in your answer, okay? So, you might remember that we have studied Martin Luther King in previous terms, so you're more or less familiar with the context. And you might also remember that on April 4, 1968, he was killed. He was shot in the head in Memphis, Tennessee. His killer, a man named James Earl Ray, was a racist man, and there is no doubt about it. He strongly believed that America should be segregated, and he was against Martin Luther King's project of putting an end to segregation in the United States, and thought that it might be necessary to cut off the head of the Black Civil Rights Movement before it actually succeeded. However, a government investigation and many other investigations showed that while he was certainly racist, those might not have been his main motivations. His main motivation might have actually been earning money, because there was apparently someone else who was never discovered who might have paid him a large sum of money if he accepted to murder Martin Luther King. But, and there is a second but, his actions had a very deep impact on American history and politics and unleashed an incredible wave of racial tensions in the late 1960s and early 1970s. The assassination of Martin Luther King was certainly a political act, regardless of whether its motivations were political or not. So, was it a terrorist attack or not? As always, I am looking forward to hear your answers, and see you next time.